Ms. Brennan commenced as the first Secretary Political at the Australian High Commission in 2012. From 2009 to 2011, Ms. Brennan worked in the South Asia branch on a range of issues including the Australia-India economic relationship, Nepal and Sri Lanka. Ms. Brennan was posted as the third secretary to the Australian High Commission in Colombo from 2005 to 2008. She worked in the Solomon Islands for 6 months in 2005. Ms. Brennan commenced as the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 2003. Welcome, ma'am. Ms. Hilary McGeechee joined the Economic Section at the High Commission in January 2016. As with Ms. Brennan, Ms. McGeechee is from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. From 2010 to 2015, she was based in Canberra, working in areas including trade negotiations and Australia's contribution to NATO-led force in Afghanistan. From 2008 to 2010, Ms. McGeechee was the third secretary at the Australian Embassy in Berlin. Ms. McGeechee joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 2006. She has an arts and a law degree.
Welcome, ma'am. I am Prashant Khurana. I'll be moderating this discussion. So our discussion will be in the form of a town hall, and we'll be having the floor open to questions from the audience at all points of time. What we'll also be doing is we've divided the discussion into three themes. So the first is foreign policy of Australia, second is the Indo-Australian relationship, and the third one is about the economy of Australia and Australia's perspective about free trade agreements across the world. So if you permit, we'll start with the first theme. All right. So I'd like to start first with Miss Cecilia. Ma'am, since you've been the political secretary, in 2007, the Liberal Party Prime Minister John Howard brought Australia into the quadrilateral security arrangement with Japan, United States of America and India, part of which was the Malabar naval exercises. Now, this decision was reversed by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd when his government got elected in 2008, and after which the Australia left the Malabar exercises as well as the QSD. But since then, there have been developments. For example, the Hague ruling about in the Permanent Court of Arbitration about the South China Sea. Then there have also been several developments in terms of United States of America establishing the pivot. And since then, Australia has also had independent exercises with United States, Japan, as well as India, as recently as in 2015. Do you think Australia will, in any point of time, start to rejoin the QSD?
Thank you very much for the question. Just a correction on, we didn't pull out of the quadrilateral. It was actually a decision not just by Australia. The timing, I think, was considered just not quite right for that grouping, but that it is something that will be considered actively in the future. You might be aware that just in 2015, Australia, India and Japan commenced a trilateral dialogue. So that's actually a very significant dialogue that we value greatly, and I think it talks to the importance for both Australia and India of our partnership with Japan. Prime Minister Modi has put a lot of emphasis on building India's relationship with Japan, and we've seen a lot of steps taken there. And the same goes for Australia. Australia has had a long-standing, deep relationship with Japan, but that's taken on a different importance under Prime Minister Abe of Japan, who is looking to change Japan's posture on defence and security. So I think that dialogue is actually a very significant one, and it complements other dialogues that are already going on. So India has, with Japan and the US, a separate trilateral dialogue, as does Australia with the US and Japan. So I think the quadrilateral is one dialogue, and maybe it has its time and place in the future, but there are already existing quite a few mechanisms for an architecture in the region that's sort of building those bridges and deepening the dialogue on issues of strategic and security importance for the region. On the naval exercise, Australia did participate in exercise Malabar in 2007. We're actually keen to participate again. So it's actually something that we're open to. So it's actually a political decision, and we hope that in the future Australia will be invited to participate again.
So, is there a direct possibility of a four-way naval exercises now between US, Japan, Australia, and India?
That is a possibility, yeah.
It's
yeah.
a possibility that you
Yeah,
look forward to.
yeah. I mean, we're not the convener of the Malabar exercise, so it would be up to India and the United States to determine who was a part of Exercise Malabar in any given year. They have invited Japan to participate for the last 2 years in a row, so that I think signals that Japan is likely to participate into the future in that grouping. It's possible that Australia and other countries, I think Singapore has also participated in the past in Exercise Malabar. So it could be the case that it's 4 of us, but it could also be the case that it's more countries than 4.
So, as far as this issue of South China Sea is concerned, ma'am, do you in the future see a sort of international coalition emerging to stop the sort of island building that's happening in that region as well? And if yes, what kind of a coalition would Australia like to see?
I don't really see a coalition building. I mean, our position on the recent ruling is clear. We've asked the parties to abide by that ruling and to return to arbitration. We don't make a ruling on between the competing claims of the claimants to the South China Sea. We are interested in what happens because we, like India and other countries around the world, have an interest in freedom of navigation, right of overflight over the South China Sea. So we have very much a vested interest. That part of the world sees a significant amount of trade passing through. So we would invite and encourage the parties to return to arbitration, but I don't at this point see a coalition building. I mean, it's something that I think was discussed quite extensively in the recent East dialogues around the East Asia Summit. So there is an interest in, but in terms of a coalition on that specific issue, we'll have to, I guess time will tell.
All right. Ma'am, there's been several developments when it comes to how Australia has been participating in the Solomon Islands. Could you elaborate slightly as to what role your country is playing and what future do you envision for the Solomon Islands in particular?
Sure. So in the late 1990s, the Solomon Islands, which is, for some of you, it's probably a distant small country that's not particularly on your radar, but it's a group of hundreds of islands actually, some of them inhabited, some of them not inhabited. It's close to Papua New Guinea. Its population is around 500,000. And in the late 1990s, it descended into conflict. So I think this had been ongoing sort of conflict between different communities that are part of the Solomon Islands. And in 2003, the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands approached Australia to come and help, basically because they had lost control of law and order in the Solomon Islands. So Australia worked together with other regional countries, including Fiji, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, and other island states within the Pacific. The Pacific Islands Forum is the body for that, for Australia as part of the world. So we worked together with our partners in the Pacific Islands Forum to bring together what is called the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands, RAMSI. So RAMSI went in 2003 with different strands to the work that they were to do. There was a security police presence, a law and justice presence, and also a machinery of government presence. So under the security presence, military was sent in initially to help de-arm the country, and so there was a gun amnesty and thousands of guns were handed over. There was no bloodshed, so that was welcome. I think the interest among Solomon Islanders was in returning the country to stability. So then the other mechanisms of RAMSI, so the machinery of government, which was supporting institutions within the Solomon Islands to rebuild and become independent, were set up, along with the law and justice, which was to build up the court system and to help bring to justice some of those that had perpetrated some of the crimes over the conflict years. So I was there in 2005, which was 2 years after Ramsay started. And the role that I had there was working in the law and justice stream primarily. So I would attend the courts on a regular basis to see that the court systems were functioning, and to watch the trial of some of the militants there actually. So it was a really interesting time to be there, to see stability returning to the Solomon Islands. I had the opportunity to travel around. It's a beautiful country, incredibly remote and undeveloped in some respects, but I mean, people have such an amazing quality of life because they have this beautiful natural environment and natural resources. And I think the future for the Solomon Islands is good. Ramsay is planning to wind down and move on totally by mid-2017. And I think, it's been 12, 13 years by that point. So it's been a $2.5 billion investment by Australia alone, and commitments from other countries. So it's taken a while to get to that point, but I think the future for the Solomon Islands is good. It will continue to, I think, need the support of the region for its economy, because it's such a small economy. It will continue to need some support, but the future is good, I think.
Considering that you have experience in this post-conflict reconstruction and specifically building legal institutions within particular countries from the Solomon Islands, are there some plans that Australia has to now move into other countries which are now recovering from conflicts, such as Afghanistan, say Tunisia or in Egypt, to be able to develop similar legal institutions there? Or is Australia wanting to work through the international route? And if that is the case, what kind of assistance are you willing to offer, and what kind of assistance are there plans of offering?
Probably going a bit beyond my direct knowledge at the moment, given that I'm operating in India. I might not be aware of plans that are going on more broadly, but I think, Australia has a significant aid program, and we work primarily through multilateral organisations, through the United Nations, through IOM and other organisations to help in post-conflict regions. In terms of Egypt or Tunisia, I couldn't comment, but I know that Hillary has some experience on Afghanistan, so she might be able to comment. But our commitment to Afghanistan has been quite strong over many years. So rebuilding the legal institutions could well be part of one of the programs that we're funding. But
yeah, thank you. And before I do, can I just say, when I was at school, I don't think I ever had questions this difficult or a horizon so broad. So thank you for letting us join. And can I also just find out who's sitting behind the Australia?
Who's representing Australia?
Who's representing Australia? Anyone?
Oh, she's not joining.
She's not, fair enough. Oh, we'll do that instead. So thank you. On the Afghanistan piece, and maybe this is half an answer to your question and just half a comment about Australia's engagement in Afghanistan. So I worked on the part of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade that dealt with the relationship between Australia and NATO, because the international force in Afghanistan until the end of 2010 was a UN mandate. I was sitting in a UN conference for NATO to lead an international force. Australia is not a NATO country, obviously, but we contributed through that mechanism. And yes, that was a military contribution, but it was also very much a capacity building effort, included a strong aid presence, as Cecilia has said, and that bilateral relationship that we have with Afghanistan continues. It expanded in that period, and it includes an aid component now, but that's a snapshot answer.
Yeah, since you work for the Department of Trade, ma'am, Ms. Hillary, I want to ask you this. The CECA between India and Australia is being worked out, and here I'm slightly stepping out of the breach of the theme that we were discussing. But one of the sticking points of that agreement have been the uranium supply to India. Now, we had an agreement between India and Australia with regards to uranium supply starting up. But that could not happen. That hasn't happened as of now. We had your ambassador, Mr. Harinder Singh, who's also saying that uranium supply might start soon. And this is a statement that he made in July of this year. What is the sticking point, if you could elaborate, between this free trade agreement between India and Australia? And is this actually a sticking point? And if yes, what process are we adopting to get rid of this?
I think there's a couple of different topics in that question, so I'll try and tackle the last one you asked, which was how do Australia and India discuss trade negotiations? And so CECA, the acronym you've just heard, stands for the bilateral trade negotiation between Australia and India, and that has been underway for a couple of years and is ongoing. I think if I was going to say in a snapshot what Australia does in trade agreements is we negotiate across all the topics you can imagine: agriculture, services, goods, investment. So there's a huge amount of topics in that. Comprehensive is the word. So in our negotiations with India, there are many topics at play and they are ongoing. I would very much put to one side any question of nuclear issues. That is not a trade matter, so it's not in the remit of a trade negotiation. I think they're very distinct topics.
So the media reports that have been floating around saying that the uranium supply agreement is one that's become a sticking point are basically not speculation.
I'm not aware of the media reports, so maybe I need to read some more media. And maybe Cecilia, from a political point, might want to tackle the nuclear. But just to clarify on that trade, trade conversation is trade negotiators sitting in a room discussing trade matters. Nuclear suppliers group question is very much in a different space and is not in the remit of a trade negotiation. But Cecilia might
I can
like
just
to
add on the nuclear. So in 2014, the Nuclear Cooperation Agreement was signed between Australia and India. And subsequent to that, so 2015 was the additional protocol, which was actually about how you move the material and the kind of some of the detail behind it. They were both agreed. It's then a commercial decision. So it's up to the supplier on Australia's side and the buyer on India's side to get together and work out an agreement. So to date, there's been no announcement on a sale, but they're in the works. So there's no obstacle as far as on our side. It's just a matter of, it's a commercial decision, and that's playing out behind the scenes, behind the commercial parties.
Let's take a question from the audience. Is there anyone who has a question on whatever we've discussed thus far?
Yeah, I do. Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm the Secretary General of the conference. We talked about the foreign policy of Australia in context. I understand that Australia primarily on the outset supported the 2001 intervention in Afghanistan. But say if I extend that question to the 2003 intervention in Iraq, led by the US and some of the other NATO members, Australia stood mostly on the sidelines. We've noticed this. Australia never really either supported that campaign of 2003, but wasn't really even strong in condemnation on their part. So, I would just like to know, what would have been the Australian stand back then?
Well, we did actually support the...
On the outset, I understand.
Yeah.
But
no, we did support, and we've had troops there right up until close to the end, and we actually still are. We, at this point, have trainers in there to help the Iraqi forces to combat terrorism at this point. So, I think different political parties in Australia probably have different positions on the invasion of Iraq, but we did support the invasion, and we have had troops in the region basically ever since. Yeah,
I understand that.
Yeah.
If I may follow up
Sure.
to that. Perhaps if I could rephrase that, my question is more in regards to the recent developments that we have observed with regards to the 2003 intervention question. Now, elements inside the United States itself have come to point out that, the actual impetus to the 2003 intervention was flawed in its very nature. So, if I talk about the present scenario where the internal politics of the United States have come to a standpoint where they themselves have started questioning that military campaign. So, what is the Australian response to that context?
I think that's a tricky question. I think, as I said, different politicians in Australia definitely feel differently about the invasion. I think Australia, the US, the UK, which other countries? That was about it, wasn't it? They were acting on the information that they had at the time. They thought that was the best intelligence, and they acted on that intelligence. It proved to be incorrect. Although, obviously, we've seen various politicians defend their position at various points. There hasn't been an inquiry process like there was in the UK, in Australia, like not to the same public degree. So, so it's not an easy question to answer, but there are definitely different opinions as to how it's obviously played out, and the instability that's currently in the region is a source of great concern to Australia and of great interest to Australia. The impact that flows on from the instability in the Middle East reaches Australia. I mean, we might be a long way from it, but we still feel the impacts in terms of people movement and in terms of the attention that is now on that part of the world. So it's definitely of great political interest in Australia.
Let's move now to the Security Council. So, our simulation of the Security Council here is discussing the agenda of reforms in the Security Council. Now, we all know that this entire issue has taken up a lot of steam with countries like India demanding their membership. We also know that there has been an implicit support from Australia about the Indian membership. But I want to ask you this. Recently, India joined the G4 in terms of demanding the membership, which essentially means they pegged their membership along with the membership of Brazil, Germany, and Japan. Does Australia think that this is a wise move on part of India to have pegged their membership with these three countries, or do you think that it becomes a problem? And do you still, in the light of that development, support India's membership? My question is to Ms. Cecilia.
We unreservedly support India's membership as a permanent member of the Security Council. In terms of the G4, that's a strategy that India has employed, and obviously that's a decision that they've come to through calculations about how they can best take forward their campaign. I wouldn't want to comment on whether that's a good strategy or not. I mean, I think everyone in this room would have to be realistic about the challenges that are ahead for all four of those countries in achieving a permanent membership of the Security Council. India has a lot of support around the world for its bid, but it doesn't take. It's pretty clear there's also some opposition. That's going to be hard to resolve or get around. So I think, in any strategy, it's going to be a challenging campaign, and I think Australia, like India, is realistic about what it's going to take to get there.
Okay. Coming to Australia and the Security Council, you recently demitted your the term of your Australia's membership ended. Does Australia plan on running again? And if yes, are you also planning to bid for a permanent membership like India to the United Nations Security Council?
We had our last seat on the Security Council in 2013-14, and we announced last year that we would be running again in 2029-2030, which is a long way from now. We do not plan to run for a permanent seat on the Security Council. So our bid in 2029-2030, the reason for that is that at the moment that term is uncontested. So we've declared well in advance that we would like to run in that time. At the moment, we're not facing competition, but that obviously could well change into the future. But I think it gives us the best time to sort of lay the groundwork for our bid. I don't know if you know how expensive running for Security Council can be. It's very expensive. I mean, for a country like India, I think it's a different game. Everyone, obviously there's a lot of support for India's permanent membership. Therefore, there's also support for India running for the Security Council. But for Australia, we run in the Western Europe and Others group. So we're running against countries in Europe, and we have to fund our campaigns, and so they can be expensive.
Becomes a different ballgame altogether.
It is a different ballgame, yeah.
Let's move now to the economy, and my question is to Ms. Hillary. Ma'am, Australia recently concluded the TPP with the United States of America, but there has been this move within the United States towards certain, a sort of a move against free trade agreements. We've seen both Hillary Clinton as well as Donald Trump, the new presidential candidates, raising slogans, saying things like the NAFTA, for example, needs to be reassessed, and even the TPP has some impact on American job. And this is something that's conceded by Ms. Clinton as well. and Donald Trump definitely goes far beyond that. Do you think that this move away from globalization is going to impact our world in future in a far more negative manner? And where does Australia stand on the idea of free trade agreements? Are you in complete support? And in the event we see American leadership going away, how does Australia plan to lead the world in the in the coming years?
So there's probably about 3 days worth of conversation in that. And I love the assumption at the end that Australia will lead the world, so thank you for that. But to go back to the start, which I think was Australia and the US concluding the TPP. So Australia was one of the 12 countries in the TPP, as I'm sure this very informed audience knows. And that agreement, when it was concluded nearly a year ago now, it's been a year since the text was finalised, is an enormous document. It's something like 1,500 pages. It's an extraordinarily detailed piece of work by literally thousands and thousands of people. So it has value in commercial outcomes for all the parties at that table. And it obviously has significance in terms of relationships. Some of those are trade, but there is also an architecture there and an agreement like that. So we would very much like to see that come into force. Having said that, and as you pointed out, it is proving to be a very political issue in a very political time in the biggest economy in the TPP, the US. So I think, maybe if you looked at that conversation 12 months ago, there were some of those sounds we've seen in the media about what will the TPP mean for a US audience. And it's really become very much enmeshed in a campaign that's got, 6 weeks left to go. So maybe that's bad timing and bad luck. Maybe there are some broader forces at work around questions of globalisation. I can't comment on the US political scene. We'd like to see that thing come into force for all the reasons I've said. So if you then say what is Australia's approach on trade agreements across the board, I could rattle off a list for you for the FTAs Australia has done with lots of the countries represented here. And I could also point to you that we work in regional agreements, and that's partly because, as Cecilia's just said, Australia's in the others part. We are located in the Indo-Pacific, in Asia. We have a heritage, we're a multicultural country. Statistically, something like half of Australia's population was either born overseas or has a parent or grandparent that was born overseas. So we're a mash-up, and we like it that way. But it also means for us, we value regional agreements. So we're in the agreement, RCEP is the acronym, that involves China and India. We have a bilateral negotiation. There are many, many ways, but we're also in the WTO, is where I would end this conversation. So for us, with all these trade pieces and all these conversations, we spend as much effort on FTAs as we do in the WTO, because ultimately, for a country like Australia, having a playing field that works for everyone works for us. So that's where we'd really like to see things move, but we do more than one thing at once by virtue of who we are and what we're made of.
Considering you mentioned the WTO and we sit in a simulation of the IMF, we are fast moving into a world where these institutions are becoming orthodox. So we have the new development bank coming in from the BRICS, we have the AIIB coming in from, led by China and the others, the 56 founding members otherwise. Do you think that what does Australia envision the role of the older organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank going in the future as more and more countries start to move towards Asia where there's newer economic opportunities? Do you think the role of these institutions, the older ones, is going to wane? And is economic power now going to be more concentrated? And what would then be Australia's approach to the older as well as the newer institutions?
Good question again. And look, I think that's partly an economic question, partly a political question, really. So those institutions, as you say, that have a legitimate operation, they're valued, they work well, that needs to continue. But yes, there is an evolution, and the new institutions you referenced are part of that evolution. The significance of that is that all the big players, be they emerged, or still coming up completely, have a stake in international architecture, because that is a way of resolving things either peacefully or ensuring financing goes where it needs to go, or that cooperation can happen to resolve economic, trade, and therefore hopefully security issues. So all of those, I think there is no black and white answer to that. It is an evolution. And where we sit regionally, but also, as I've mentioned, in terms of our population, we want to see the right combination of those institutions work, because they will need to adapt, and that's why there is a drive for new institutions. That's maybe not a specific set of examples, but I think that's a...
Let's just move back to the audience one. Anyone from the IMF or from the Security Council have a comment? Yes.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm acting as the president of the Security Council, and my question is to Ms. Cecilia. Talking from a neutral perspective, talking from the perspective of a person who looks at the Security Council as a body which essentially solves security issues plaguing this world, do you not think that increasing the membership of the Security Council, that too with increasing the permanent members, will result in dilution of effectiveness of the Security Council, meaning decisions will take more time, though there will be more views incorporated, but essentially it will change the semantics of how decisions are being taken, especially with the current scenarios which are right now plaguing this world?
Yeah, that is a possibility. I mean, I think the more countries around the table in the Security Council, the more possibility there is for disagreement and non-consensus. I think, though, the countries that formed the Security Council, the permanent members, they reflected the power balance that existed post-World War II. We're now 60, 70 years on, things have changed, and I think that the Security Council should reflect more of the globe as it is today. So, sure, there might be more problems encountered by expanding the Security Council, but I think those conversations need to go on about what the reform's going to entail. Obviously no one with a permanent 5 seat wants to lose their seat, so it's going to be hard though. So I mean, I know I'm not a privy to those conversations going on in New York, where as a representative here in Delhi, we see a little bit, but we don't see everything. So I don't know exactly what's being said, but I know there are different options on the table, and those negotiations are going to take a while to reach an end point. But as I said before, I think that a Security Council without India, with its population and its importance in the world, is just not a Security Council that, should be respected. I think in today's world, it needs to reflect the globe as it is today.
Okay, let's just move now to some positive news. Ms. Hillary, your economy recently marked a successful 25th year of constant growth. This is something that's happened after the 2008 Lehman collapse, after the Eurozone crisis, and even the dot-com bust that happened in the early 2000s. What is this structure within the Australian economy that is powering this growth year after year? And what is it that other countries can learn from Australia?
I'd like to declare in answering this question that I'm not an economist, and for all of you that are, be nice to me. And I suspect everyone in this room is 25 or less. I'm just going to take that generally. So 25 years is an incredibly long time, and there's a figure that we can say proudly Australia's growth has been on an upward trajectory for that period, and we've survived various financial crises. So why is that? Some of it's luck and some of it's good management. What's the luck? The luck is probably the state of our regulatory systems, what we have in terms of what we sell to the world at various times. We've had a resources boom. We've had open trade links with some very significant trading partners for Australia: US, China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, all of whom we have a FTA with, I might add. So what's the message we say other than feeling fortunate for our situation? I think what we see out of that is there was, I'd say for the first 50, 60 years, of the last century, Australia was an incredibly protectionist economy, focused on manufacturing in Australia, and it essentially came to a point where we realised, not all at once, but realised that we were not really doing ourselves any favours. We had industry unable to participate on the world stage. So there was a reform process that went on in Australia. And that left us in a position where we could play with our advantages and trade with our advantages and work in those markets where we had the best competitive edge, I guess. So when we sit in Delhi now, and I've only been here less than a year, but there's obviously a very substantial reform that's been going on in India for some years. And there's also a reform agenda that continues. That ongoing process and seeing those reforms play out either through unilateral liberalisation, where India says, I take these tariffs down, or I change my regulatory system, or I agree, that this is now the treatment I will give a foreign company. Seeing that economic reform and development play out in an openness to international trade, I think that's the observation we have. And I think that pattern was one that we would hope to see continue, because there is such amazing opportunity in this country, and such amazing reform and such amazing activity that it is one of wonderment really to most people that come here. So from our position, that's our snapshot, I guess.
Indeed. Since you mentioned mining, Australia is one of those rare countries which has a substantial portion of things like coal coming out, fossil fuel and other coal also coming out of its mining reserves. Yet Australia is not one of those countries which tries to block agreements on climate change because it's worried that its coal reserves, its coal exports are going to go down, that's going to hurt its economy. How is it that, how do you maintain this sort of a balance between understanding your role that you have to play in an international institution while also balancing your domestic needs? Because there are countries, and I don't wish to name them, but there are countries which export crude oil, and they say that we don't want climate change agreements because they ultimately hinder our ability to export all of these resources that we have.
I think that's a really interesting question, because it picks up, I guess, some similarities between India and Australia. That is, we're both countries that have got a lot of coal. We sell a lot of it, we sell a lot of the technology, but as you say, we are also a country that has very much been part of climate change negotiations in various forms and, to be frank, various positions over the last decade. Politics plays its part in this. But where we are now is you have a Paris Agreement, you have a commitment to country contributions. And I sit in a country here where coal is part of the energy future for India, for the...
Probably my second last question is for the both of you. What would you count as the top 5 achievements of your stay here in India?
Over to you.
Yeah, let's just begin with Mrs. Cecilia first.
Well, one thing that I worked on recently was the New Colombo Plan. So this is an initiative of our Foreign Minister to give Australian tertiary students the opportunity to study in Asia. So I worked on this basically to make this project happen in India. So that involved reaching out to universities around the country and working with Australian universities to try and create linkages between institutions to try and create opportunities for Australians to come and have the opportunity to live and study in, this amazing country. So that's something that I think is fantastic and also is an enduring thing. So the numbers of students from Australia coming to India have increased in the last couple of years, and they're going to continue to increase. Top 5. Maybe
it can be top 3 as well.
Okay.
I'm just slightly less conservative with numbers.
Yeah. The trilateral between Australia, Japan and India is something that I worked on. So yeah, that's something that I'm pretty proud of. I think that's a great grouping. It's a grouping that makes sense in in a future, from Australia's perspective, a future where the Indo-Pacific is so important for our interests. So I think that grouping complements the strengths and the relationships, the bilateral relationships that already exist. So I'm proud of that grouping, being achieved. And then in 2014, I had, the privilege of working on 2 prime ministerial visits in the course of 3 months. So we had Prime Minister Abbott coming to India, and he did I think it was a two-day visit, 2 and a bit day visit. And then within, 2 months, we had Modi going to Australia. And they were both, it was a really busy year, and we had a lot going on in 2015, sort of following up on those 2 visits, but making those visits happen in that shorter period of time when we hadn't had an Indian Prime Minister go to Australia for such a long time.
26 years.
Exactly. It was, a fantastic year. So that's probably the top 3 for me.
I'm going to duck out of your question slightly because I think that's part of the job description, right? I have only been in New Delhi since the end of January, and I think if I was answering this question, I would say what are the things I've really enjoyed doing in working for Foreign Affairs for the best part of a decade, because I'm speaking to an audience of young people, and I hope that you guys will join your Foreign Service. And the top 5, top 3 is the sheer variety of different areas that you get to have outcomes in. So I've worked on, TPP. I was part of the TPP negotiating team for Australia. I'm very proud that we concluded that text, and I hope it goes through. I worked on an MOU on environment. So an agreement where we have bilateral discussions on environment. So what does that do? It brings together experts, it brings together business, it puts the meat on the bones of some of the topics we've just talked about. I've worked on NATO and how does Australia, have forces in Afghanistan. It's a security question, it's a foreign policy question, it's worlds apart from trade. So I am proud of and I've enjoyed that range, and there's achievements you can have in those areas, and so if I can just step aside from the UN piece, I recommend it highly, guys, if you get a chance to do it, so thank you.
Okay, so my last question is actually a personal one. Considering that I'm visibly a foodie, I want to understand as to which country's food have you enjoyed the most and what has been that food, both of you.
Toughest of all.
That is a hard question. There's so many. I mean, part of the reason that I wanted to be a diplomat was because I love food. No, because I wanted to live overseas, and part of being overseas is trying new things and being a part of a new culture, and food is definitely, an amazing part of that. I love Indian food. Like I think that when you come to India and you live in India, you see a much wider variety than you do in Australia. In Australia, we have mostly North Indian food, and that's great. But there is also so much great food from the south and from Madhya Pradesh. Like I had the best thali that I've ever had in India in Madhya Pradesh, I think. So I can't really pin it down, but I love Indian food. I love Thai food. So a bit of spice is always good.
I don't know how to add to that, because I think I'll say a similar thing, but it's true. Australia's. If you get asked, typically someone will say, come to or host a dinner, come to the Australian High Commission and we'll host a dinner. And I think if you went to the Indian High Commission in Australia, you'd expect a certain range of food groups probably. What would you put on for an Australian meal? It could be Japanese, it could be Singaporean, it could be steak, excuse me, but it could be a whole range of food stuff. So getting to be around the world and experience that a little bit more than how we do it in Australia and authentically.
All right. Good afternoon, ma'am. I am the managing director of the IMF. My question is a pretty simple one. Since all of us know very well that Australia is a rapidly developing economy and it has been on a stable path in the last 25 years, are you looking to take a step forward of the bilateral and multilateral agreements by establishing a union or basically an organization such as the BRICS for growing with other countries in unity, amongst unity?
In an economic organisation or like a...
Either one.
Okay.
Economic or political.
I think for us, Hillary might have some other things to add. For Australia, one of the most important organisations for the Indo-Pacific is the East Asia Summit. That's an organisation that we value really highly because it brings together ASEAN, which is, really core centre for this region. I think when ASEAN began, no one thought it would last or be as enduring as it has been, and it's really demonstrated that it can bring those countries together. And the EAS is obviously an extension of that, bringing together, I think it's, about 55, 60, maybe higher percentage of the world's population with China and India, the United States. It must be higher than that. It's got, the majority of the world's trade, and it's, it's become a forum that's not just about the economy. It's bringing together, defence and strategic issues. The South China Sea is discussed there quite frequently, basically every year, and at different levels of meeting. So for us, the East Asia Summit really sort of brings together some of the key players, and that's an institution that we're going to continue to put energies into. There may be other groupings that come up. I think on different issues there'll be coalitions of countries working together. So that's going to happen, but I think it'll happen somewhat organically around different issues. There's no sort of, at the moment, plan to form another mini regional architecture from our perspective.
So you talked a lot about change, about sending students from, for example, from Australia to India to study, about supplying trainers to Afghanistan, about helping the Solomon Islands, and about how the Australian population is in many ways a melting pot. So I think we got a really clear insight into the values that exist within Australia. So I guess my question is, how does the very closed border refugee policy that Australia is going with fit into the bigger picture with these values?
I guess that's a topical, tricky question. I mean, from Australia's perspective, we've seen too many deaths at sea. From countries that neighbour India, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, we've seen boats that no one sees again. And the decision to stop the boats was the slogan that the government's been using, very much revolves around safety at sea, removing the model that exists, so whereby people smugglers target vulnerable people to encourage them to get on a boat with the promise of a job at the other end. That's basically the model that they're using. Along the way, a lot of people have lost their lives. People have lost money, their livelihoods, their life savings. Australia has a very generous refugee intake. Every year we take around 14,000 people, and we're upping that to around 18,000, 19,000 in coming years. We're also taking 12,000 from Syria and Iraq in the next few years. So we're doing what we can, but doing it through avenues that don't encourage these models whereby people smugglers are taking advantage of people. You mentioned the melting pot. The multicultural Australia, the melting pot, sort of exists on the basis that the government has control of our borders. There is anxiety about people coming, unknown people, and there are those security concerns. I know Germany faces some of those security concerns, and they're valid. So I guess there's a range of reasons why Australia has a tough policy, but ultimately it's about sort of breaking the illegal avenues and encouraging people to go through legitimate avenues. And we work very closely with the IOM and United Nations Refugee Agency to bring refugees to Australia, but using avenues that we can work with and have visibility of.
Thank you, ma'am. Before I invite the IMF chairperson for a vote of thanks, our director, ma'am, if you would like to say a few words.
Firstly, thank you for accepting our invitation and addressing our young delegates. It is an honor to have you both here. On behalf of the Rhine Group, I personally would like to thank you for your presence and offer insights into the world view on politics from the Australian context. So thank you so much for being here and encouraging our young delegates who are obviously striving towards developing that holistic perspective on things that may not be as they seem to the eye. So it's a lot more complex. There are many layers to negotiation and diplomacy. And thank you for offering your insight on the same. God bless you.
On behalf of the entire Ryan fraternity, I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude for you for gracing this occasion with your presence. Also, the things that we learned today are no things that we can learn from conventional means. This is actually a very extraordinary moment for us to actually see you and interact with you, which opportunity we do not get each and every time or very easily. So I'd like to thank you. Also, I'm sure whatever you said would guide us in every step of the way and helping us and contributing us in becoming the successful diplomats and young diplomats of the future. Thank you so much, ma'am.
I just wanted to say a quick thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, and I congratulate you on all getting together and having an interest in international affairs. I myself went to a Model United Nations conference at university, actually, not at school, but at university. So I know what good fun they are and what you can learn from them, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.